The photograph did not just wound her, it dismantled 5 years of devotion in a single merciless instant. Emily Parker stared at the glowing screen while the candles around her burned steadily, unaware that the marriage they were meant to celebrate had already collapsed. Daniel Brooks stood beneath the warm amber lights of Lamont Clare, his tailored coat draped perfectly over his shoulders, Vanessa Cole's hand resting intimately on his arm as if it had never left. Vanessa's crimson dress clung like a deliberate provocation, her smile tilted upward toward Daniel with familiarity that cut deeper than betrayal. The timestamp in the corner of the image read 7:48 in the evening. Their 5th anniversary dinner had been set for 7. The roasted duck on the marble island had gone cold by 8:15. By 9, the champagne bottle, once chilled in anticipation, sweated silently in its silver bucket. At 9:40, Emily finally understood that waiting was no longer devotion. It was humiliation. The penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan shimmered with curated elegance, a home built on success and sacrifice. Emily had arranged white roses across the dining table, folded linen napkins with meticulous care, and slipped into the emerald silk dress Daniel once claimed made her eyes glow like polished jade. She had rehearsed her smile in the mirror, convincing herself that this year would be different, that Daniel would choose presence over profit. When the elevator doors slid open just before 10 in the evening, the sharp echo through the foyer sounded less like arrival and more like reckoning. Daniel entered with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being admired. His charcoal suit remained immaculate, his expression mildly distracted as though the world existed only to serve his momentum. He paused when he noticed the candles, the table, her still figure standing beside it. Surprise flickered across his face quickly, masked by composure. Emily did not shout. She did not tremble. She simply lifted her phone and turned the screen toward him, the image illuminating the truth between them like a verdict delivered without appeal. "It is not what it looks like," he said, the words automatic, rehearsed by instinct. He explained that Vanessa's father was considering a major investment, that the meeting had been unavoidable, that the company's expansion depended on diplomacy. Millions were at stake. Future growth. Strategic positioning. The vocabulary of ambition poured from him effortlessly, each phrase polished and persuasive, yet none of it addressed the empty chair across from Emily at the table or the anniversary that had passed unnoticed by the man who once promised her forever. She felt the shift inside her, then subtle but irreversible. For 5 years, she had reorganized her life around his ascent, leaving behind her design fellowship in New York, shelving her own portfolio to manage charity galas that elevated his public image. She had become the supportive wife, the poised presence beside a rising titan. In private, she had convinced herself that sacrifice was proof of love. In truth, she had been erasing herself piece by piece, calling it devotion. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice as though calmness could erase consequence. "Do not be dramatic, Emily. This deal secures our future. Our future." The phrase hung between them hollow and thin. Emily's laughter surprised even her, soft and brittle as cracking glass. A future built on canceled dinners and postponed conversations. A future where she dressed beautifully for a man who never looked up from his phone long enough to notice. On the console behind her rested a cream envelope, prepared that morning during a moment of quiet clarity she had tried to dismiss. She had hoped she would not need it. Now she understood that hope without action was merely self-deception. "I filed the papers today," she said evenly, her voice steadier than her pulse. The word divorce seemed to strip the air of oxygen. Daniel stared at her disbelief, replacing confidence, as if the possibility had never occurred to him that she might choose herself over him. He moved toward her urgency, cracking through his composure, promising change, promising balance, promising to do better. But promises had become currency, long devalued. Emily realized something powerful in that silence. He saw her as fragile, emotional dependent. He did not see the trust fund quietly secured in her name, the design awards she had once earned, the capability she had willingly hidden to protect his pride. He had mistaken restraint for weakness. "Sign them," she said, placing the envelope in his hands. "Not because I am hurt, because I finally remembered who I am." The candles flickered lower as if bowing to the end of something sacred. Daniel Brooks, master negotiator, stood wordless in the ruins of his own certainty, and Emily Parker, underestimated and overlooked, walked toward the bedroom, not as a woman abandoned, but as a woman awakened. Emily Parker did not look back when the elevator doors closed behind her. She was afraid that if she did, 5 years of habit would drag her upstairs again. The overnight bag in her hand felt impossibly light for something that carried the weight of an entire life unraveling. Chicago's night air struck her cheeks with a cold honesty she almost welcomed. The city roared, as it always had, indifferent to broken marriages and whispered ultimatums. Taxis streamed past in ribbons of light. Couples laughed beneath street lamps, and somewhere high above the skyline, Daniel Brooks was likely standing in a penthouse filled with dying candles and unsigned papers. Emily felt strangely untethered, as though the gravity that had once held her in orbit around his ambition had finally loosened its grip. Laura opened the door before Emily could knock. Older by 3 years and infinitely more practical, Laura Parker did not ask for explanations. She simply stepped aside, pulled her sister into a firm embrace, and said, "You can take the guest room for as long as you need." The apartment in Lincoln Park was modest compared to the penthouse Emily had just left, but it breathed with warmth instead of prestige. The couch bore the imprint of real use. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and basil. It felt human. That first night, Emily lay awake staring at a ceiling free of recessed designer lighting and thought about the silence upstairs in her old home. She expected grief to flood her, but what came instead was a startling calm. Pain, yes. Betrayal, certainly. But beneath it all, a flicker of something steadier. For years, she had introduced herself as Daniel's wife at galas and investor dinners, smiling, while strangers measured her worth by proximity. Now, for the first time in half a decade, she was simply Emily again. The realization was terrifying. It was also intoxicating. By morning, practicality replaced sentiment. Emily refused to become a cautionary tale whispered about in charity circles. She updated her resume, trimmed the gaps created by years of unpaid social hosting, and applied to positions across the city. She did not touch the trust fund account that sat quietly under her maiden name, substantial enough to sustain her for decades. That money had always been her insurance, never her identity. If she was rebuilding, she would do it on her own terms. The interview at Harrison & Company Jewelers felt almost ironic. Once upon a time, she had presented collections to elite buyers in Manhattan. Now, she sat across from a hiring manager explaining why she wanted a sales associate position. The manager, polite but unconvinced, glanced at her simple blazer and understated heels, and saw only a recently separated woman seeking distraction. Emily did not correct the assumption. She answered calmly, describing her appreciation for craftsmanship, her understanding of gemstones, her belief that jewelry carried memory more than price tags. The manager hesitated, then offered her the job. The first week on the showroom floor was humbling in ways that cut deeper than divorce. Clients sometimes dismissed her with distracted waves, assuming she was inexperienced. One woman asked if she could fetch someone more senior to discuss a custom engagement ring. Emily smiled and complied, even though she could have sketched a better design than the consultant who replaced her. Each dismissal scraped at her pride, but she absorbed it deliberately. Power, she reminded herself, did not always announce itself. Sometimes it waited. Then came the afternoon that shifted everything. Michael Harris, the 42-year-old owner of the boutique, arrived to select a ring for his longtime partner. He listened to the senior consultant recite rehearsed descriptions, his expression increasingly uncertain. Emily stood quietly nearby, reorganizing display trays. When Michael asked for something timeless but distinctive, she found herself speaking before caution intervened. Perhaps a cushion cut diamond set in a platinum band with hand-engraved detailing, she suggested softly. It would feel classic without disappearing into tradition. The room fell silent. The consultant frowned. Michael studied her instead of the display. Why that choice, he asked. Emily stepped forward and explained the balance of proportion, the way light would refract through that specific cut, the emotional resonance of handcrafted elements. She spoke not as a salesperson, but as a designer who had once lived inside studios and sketches. For a moment, she forgot to be smaller than she was. Michael did not laugh. He did not dismiss her. Instead, he asked a second question, and then a third. The consultant shifted uneasily while Emily described setting techniques and stone grading with quiet authority. When she finished, Michael's eyes held something new: recognition. After closing time, he called her into his office. "You are not just here to sell, are you?" he said. Emily hesitated, then chose honesty. "No, I used to design." He leaned back in his chair, studying her as though recalibrating an equation. "Bring me 3 original sketches by next week," he said finally. "If they are as strong as your instincts, we will have a different conversation." As she walked home that evening, beneath a sky washed in violet light, Emily felt the first real surge of hope since the night she left the penthouse. Daniel had underestimated her resilience. The boutique staff had underestimated her experience. The world had grown comfortable, assuming she was decorative. They were wrong. And for the first time in years, Emily Parker was ready to prove it. Daniel Brooks did not recognize the woman standing behind the glass display case, and that realization unsettled him more than the divorce papers waiting on his desk. Emily Parker looked composed, focused, luminous in a way that had nothing to do with him. It had been 3 weeks since she left the penthouse. 3 weeks of silence broken only by legal emails and unanswered messages. Daniel had told himself she needed space, that she would calm down, that 5 years of marriage could not dissolve so quickly. Yet standing inside Harrison and Company Jewelers, watching her lean over a tray of diamonds while explaining clarity grades to a client with patient precision, he felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: fear. The boutique lights cast a soft glow over her hair, which was pulled back in a simple twist. She wore no emerald silk tonight, no expensive jewelry, only a fitted black blouse and a name badge pinned neatly to her collar. To the untrained eye, she was just another sales associate earning commission. Daniel, however, noticed the way the store owner lingered near her listening. He noticed the confidence in her posture. He noticed that she did not once glance toward the door as though expecting him. When their eyes finally met, the air shifted. Emily did not flinch. She did not smile either. She excused herself from the client with professional ease and approached him slowly, hands folded in front of her, expression unreadable. Daniel felt absurdly out of place among glass cases and velvet ring boxes, the architect of a corporate empire reduced to a man unsure of his own footing. "What are you doing here?" she asked quietly. There was no hostility in her tone, only distance. "I needed to see you," he replied, the words heavier than he intended. He searched her face for softness and found resolve instead. The owner, Michael Harris, watched from a respectful distance, clearly aware that this was not a routine customer interaction. Daniel sensed scrutiny and realized that in this space he was not the most powerful presence. Emily was. They stepped aside near a display of platinum bands. Daniel had rehearsed speeches in the privacy of his office, practiced humility the way he once practiced investor pitches. But standing before her, the lines dissolved. "I have been in therapy," he said bluntly, abandoning pretense. "Twice a week. I stepped back from daily operations. I ended negotiations with Vanessa's father. I thought I was building security for us, but I was hiding in work. Emily listened without interruption. Her gaze did not waver yet. Something flickered beneath it, something guarded but not entirely closed. Daniel continued speaking faster now, urgency cracking through his composure. I did not realize how much I was losing until you were gone. The penthouse feels empty. I feel empty. The admission cost him more than any financial loss ever had. In boardrooms, vulnerability was weakness. Here it was necessity. Emily's fingers traced the edge of the glass counter, steady, thoughtful. This is not about one dinner, Daniel, she said finally. It is about years of being an afterthought. You made decisions without me, prioritized deals over conversations, and called it providing. I did not want your money. I wanted your presence. Her words struck with surgical clarity. Daniel inhaled sharply, recognizing truth he had avoided for years. I cannot undo the past, he said, voice lower now, stripped of executive polish. But give me 6 months. 6 months to prove I can be different. Not with promises, with actions. If I fail, we finalize everything. I will not fight you again. The number hung between them like a contract clause neither had anticipated. 6 months, a finite period, measurable, concrete. For a man who understood timelines and deliverables, it was the only language he knew how to offer. Emily considered him carefully, as though evaluating a gemstone for hidden fractures. She saw exhaustion in his eyes, a humility that had not existed before. She also saw fear. Not fear of scandal or financial loss, but fear of losing her entirely. It would have been easier if he had come arrogantly assuming she would return. Instead, he stood before her uncertain, almost undone. I am not pausing my life for you, she said at last. I have opportunities here. I am rebuilding. If I agree to this, it is not to wait. It is to observe. Daniel nodded immediately. Observe me. That is all I am asking. Across the store, Michael Harris pretended to rearrange a display while discreetly absorbing every detail. He saw a powerful man humbled and a woman who no longer leaned toward him for validation. The dynamic was unmistakable. Daniel might command corporations, but in this moment, Emily held the authority. I need time to think, she concluded. Do not show up here again without asking. This is my space now. The statement was simple, yet it reverberated with finality. Daniel accepted it without argument. As he turned to leave, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Respect. Not for her resilience alone, but for the version of her he had never truly seen. Behind the glass counters and diamond lights, Emily Parker stood grounded in her own rising strength. For the first time, Daniel understood that winning her back would not require persuasion. It would require transformation. Emily Parker did not mark the beginning of the 6 months with a calendar notification or a dramatic vow. She marked it by sharpening her pencils and clearing a space on Laura's kitchen table. If Daniel intended to prove transformation through action, she would do the same, but for herself. The first sketch came after midnight, when the city quieted and doubt grew louder. She drew a delicate chain that fractured into wings at its center, each feather etched with fine lines that suggested both restraint and release. She called it Freedom Unbound. The design was not merely ornamental. It was confession in metal form. For years she had been the silent extension of someone else's ambition, polished and presentable, never fully seen. Now her hands moved with urgency, graphite whispering against paper, as if reclaiming territory long surrendered. At Harrison and Company, the shift in her demeanor did not go unnoticed. Emily no longer hovered at the periphery of conversations. She asked precise questions about sourcing and margins, about custom molds and casting timelines. Michael Harris began inviting her into meetings he once conducted behind closed doors. The senior consultant who had dismissed her weeks earlier watched with quiet discomfort as clients increasingly requested Emily by name. Power was not declared. It accumulated. Her second design emerged from memory rather than anger, a ring shaped like a phoenix rising the band twisting upward into subtle flames that cradled a diamond instead of overpowering it. She adjusted the proportions repeatedly, refusing excess, seeking balance between strength and elegance. This piece was not about survival. It was about rebirth without bitterness. When she finally leaned back from the sketch at 2:30 in the morning, exhaustion mingled with exhilaration. She had not felt this alive in years. Daniel kept his distance as promised. No unexpected appearances. No grand gestures. Instead, subtle evidence of change filtered through mutual acquaintances. He had stepped down from daily operations, delegating responsibilities he once guarded fiercely. He left the office before sunset twice in 1 week. He attended therapy consistently, a fact he did not publicize but did not hide. Emily absorbed the information without comment, storing it like data in a ledger. Observation, not emotion, would determine the outcome. Her third design startled even her. A bracelet composed of interlocking geometric shapes, each piece slightly different yet forming a cohesive whole. She engraved the interior with the phrase, "Choose every day." It was less romantic than her earlier work, more grounded. Love, she realized, was not sustained by intensity alone, but by intention repeated deliberately. The realization was not solely about Daniel. It was about herself. She would no longer disappear inside someone else's narrative. When she presented the 3 sketches to Michael, the air in his office shifted palpably. He studied each drawing in silence, tracing the lines with careful attention. "These are not beginner concepts," he said finally. "These are statements." Emily did not downplay the compliment. She met his gaze steadily and allowed him to see the confidence she had once hidden. "I never stopped being a designer," she replied. "I only stopped claiming it." Within 2 weeks, Michael offered her the position of lead designer for a new collection. The promotion came without fanfare, but carried undeniable weight. The staff responded with a mix of admiration and envy, recalibrating their assumptions about the quiet woman they once overlooked. Emily accepted the role with measured composure, aware that validation from others mattered less than the internal shift she already felt. She was no longer rebuilding. She was ascending. Late one evening, as she locked the boutique doors, she caught her reflection in the darkened glass. There were faint circles beneath her eyes from long nights of work, graphite smudges on her fingertips, and a spark in her expression that had nothing to do with romance. For the first time since leaving the penthouse, she did not wonder whether Daniel would change enough to deserve her. She wondered whether she would even want the same life by the time 6 months ended. The realization was both unsettling and liberating. Daniel's transformation was no longer the axis of her world. Her own evolution was. In the quiet of Laura's apartment, surrounded by sketches and casting samples, Emily Parker stepped fully into her creative authority. She had once been underestimated as merely decorative and accessory to a powerful man. Now, as prototypes began taking shape under her direction, she understood the deeper truth. She had always been powerful. She had simply been waiting to remember. By the 3rd month, the silence between Emily and Daniel no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a test, not of endurance, but of authenticity. Emily's Metamorphosis collection began to take physical form in the workshop. Molten gold poured into molds shaped from her once fragile sketches. The phoenix ring emerged, first flame curves polished to a restrained brilliance that caught light without demanding it. Clients responded with fascination, drawn not only to the craftsmanship, but to the story woven invisibly into each piece. Strength after fracture, beauty after departure. Emily did not publicly explain the inspiration, yet those who tried on her designs sensed the narrative beneath the metal. She had stopped designing for approval. She was designing from truth. At the boutique, her authority solidified quietly. Vendors negotiated with her directly. Clients waited for her consultation even when others were available. The senior consultant who once dismissed her now sought her opinion on gemstone settings, masking insecurity with polite professionalism. Emily did not retaliate with ego. She responded with clarity and composure. Power, she had learned, was most convincing when it did not need to announce itself. She was no longer proving herself. She was simply inhabiting herself. Meanwhile, Daniel Brooks was discovering that transformation was less glamorous than ambition. Stepping back from daily operations felt like amputating part of his identity. Board meetings ran without his dominating presence. Decisions were made that he would once have controlled. At first, he filled the empty hours with restless energy, pacing through offices that no longer revolved around him. Therapy sessions forced him to confront truths he had long disguised as discipline. He had equated worth with productivity. He had mistaken control for stability, and in doing so he had neglected the only partnership that required his full attention. The reports filtering back to Emily were subtle but consistent. He left the office before dark more often than not. He declined a high-profile merger that would have required extensive travel. He began mentoring young entrepreneurs at a community innovation center twice a week, sitting across from students who reminded him of himself before prestige hardened his edges. For the first time in years, Daniel listened more than he spoke. The shift was gradual, unpublicized, almost private. It was also real. Emily noticed the difference when they met for coffee halfway through the 4th month. The meeting was neutral daylight filtering through tall windows of a quiet cafe near the river. Daniel arrived without an entourage, without the armor of tailored arrogance. He asked about her collection and listened without interrupting. When she described a design challenge involving asymmetrical balance, he did not redirect the conversation to market strategy. He simply asked how she solved it. The simplicity of his curiosity unsettled her more than grand gestures ever had. Yet tension lingered beneath the surface. 6 months was not a romantic metaphor. It was a ticking measure. Emily felt it in the way he paused before speaking, careful not to dominate. Daniel felt it in the way she evaluated him without visible emotion. Neither mentioned the legal papers resting with her attorney, paused but not destroyed. Their interactions were deliberate, measured. Growth was happening on both sides, but trust once fractured, rebuilt slowly. By the 5th month, Emily had moved into a small lakeside rental in Wisconsin, seeking space beyond the city's constant hum. The house was modest, framed by tall trees and water that reflected shifting skies. She painted the interior soft white, filled it with drafting tables and potted plants, and allowed silence to become restorative rather than lonely. Daniel visited once at her invitation, bringing nothing but a simple bouquet of white tulips. He did not critique the size of the house. He did not suggest improvements. He simply stood beside her on the dock and watched the water move. There, in that stillness, both understood something unspoken. The old version of their marriage could not be revived. If anything survived, it would have to be rebuilt from equal ground. Emily no longer needed the security of his empire. Daniel no longer believed success excused absence. The transformation was incomplete, fragile, yet unmistakable. As the 6th month approached, anticipation tightened quietly around them. This was no longer about proving devotion through sacrifice. It was about choice. About whether two individuals who had grown separately could meet again without losing themselves. For the first time in their history, neither of them was chasing the other. They were walking cautiously toward a decision that would define not just their marriage, but the people they had become. The invitation arrived on heavy cream cardstock, embossed with gold lettering announcing the International Jewelry Exhibition in New York, as though it were less an event and more a coronation. Emily Parker read it twice before allowing herself to believe it was real. Her Metamorphosis collection had been selected for showcase among established designers whose names once intimidated her. The gallery space overlooked the Hudson River, its ceilings high and luminous, its walls lined with glass cases that gleamed beneath precise white lighting. On the evening of the exhibition, Emily stood beside her display in a sleek midnight blue gown, understated yet deliberate, her hair swept back to reveal the quiet confidence in her posture. Guests drifted from case to case, murmuring appreciation, pausing longer than expected before the phoenix ring and the bracelet engraved with "Choose every day." They did not know the history embedded in the metal, but they felt it. Michael Harris stood at her side, pride barely concealed. Retailers from Los Angeles and Boston asked about production timelines. A fashion editor from a prominent magazine scribbled notes. For the first time in years, Emily felt not like an accessory to someone else's success, but the architect of her own ascent. The room hummed with validation earned through labor rather than proximity. She had not told Daniel about the exhibition. It was not out of cruelty, but caution. She did not want his presence to feel obligatory or strategic. She wanted this moment to belong to her alone. Yet somewhere between admiration and negotiation, the gallery doors opened and a quiet ripple moved through the crowd. Daniel Brooks entered without announcement, dressed in a tailored navy suit, his expression composed yet uncharacteristically restrained. He did not approach her immediately. Instead, he stood near the entrance, speaking softly to an elderly woman whose silver hair was arranged elegantly at her nape. Emily recognized her before her mind fully processed it. Isabelle Laurent, the legendary French designer whose minimalist pieces had redefined modern luxury for decades. Isabelle rarely attended public exhibitions, and when she did, it was for artists already established at the pinnacle of their careers. The sight of her examining Emily's collection sent a surge of disbelief through the room. Isabelle moved slowly from piece to piece, gloved fingers hovering near the glass as though sensing texture through distance. She studied the phoenix ring longest, her sharp eyes absorbing every curve. Finally, she turned to Emily. "You created these?" she said, her accent soft but unmistakable. Emily nodded, suddenly aware of her own heartbeat. Isabel's gaze held neither flattery nor condescension. Only evaluation. "There is restraint here," she continued. "Pain but not indulgence. Power without noise. That is rare." The words settled over Emily like a mantle. Around them, conversations quieted. Daniel remained several steps back, observing without interruption. Isabelle reached into her handbag and withdrew a simple card. "I am reopening my atelier in Paris next spring. I select only 3 designers every 5 years to study under me. I would like you to be one of them. Full scholarship, living stipend included. No obligation beyond excellence." The gallery seemed to inhale collectively. Paris. The word carried weight heavier than any diamond in the room. Emily's gaze instinctively sought Daniel's. He met her eyes without triumph, without expectation. There was only steady encouragement. "How did you even know about my work?" she asked Isabelle, voice barely steady. Isabelle gestured subtly toward Daniel. "He contacted me 3 months ago. Sent photographs of your collection. He did not request favoritism. He asked only that I judge your talent honestly. I am not easily persuaded, but I am impressed." The revelation struck deeper than applause ever could. 3 months ago, Daniel had no guarantee of reconciliation. The divorce papers had still hovered unresolved. Yet he had chosen to amplify her opportunity without leverage, without announcement. He had invested in her future knowing it might not include him. After Isabelle moved on to greet other patrons, Emily stepped toward Daniel. "You did this?" she said quietly. "I forwarded your work," he replied, just as quietly. "Because you deserve to be seen whether or not you choose to remain in my life." There was no desperation in his tone, no plea, only truth. In that moment, the 6-month deadline transformed from ultimatum into clarity. Daniel had once measured success in expansion charts and profit margins. Now he stood in a crowded gallery prepared to let her leave for another continent if it meant honoring who she was becoming. Emily felt the axis of their relationship shift irrevocably. This was not a performance. It was release. As the evening closed, and the Hudson reflected city lights like scattered jewels, Emily held Isabel's card in her hand and understood that her life was expanding beyond geography. Paris was possibility. Freedom was real. And Daniel, standing quietly beside her without claim or demand, had finally proven something no contract ever could. He had learned how to love without possession. The gallery lights dimmed one by one, leaving only the soft reflection of Manhattan's skyline shimmering against the tall glass windows. Emily Parker stood alone for a moment. Isabelle Laurent's invitation card resting in her palm like a compass pointing toward a life she had once been too afraid to claim. Paris was no longer a fantasy whispered in design studios. It was real, tangible waiting. Yet the choice before her was no longer between ambition and love. It was between fear and courage. Daniel Brooks approached without spectacle. His footsteps measured his posture, stripped of the commanding certainty that once defined him. 6 months ago, he would have filled this silence with persuasion, arguing his case like a merger negotiation. Tonight, he simply stood beside her, allowing the city lights to speak before he did. "I signed the final divorce documents this morning," he said quietly. "They are already with your attorney. You are free, Emily." The word free echoed in the space between them. It was not delivered with resentment or strategy. It carried no hidden clause, no emotional leverage. It was clean. Emily studied his face carefully, searching for traces of manipulation and finding none. In his eyes, she saw something she had never seen before. Acceptance. Not of defeat, but of responsibility. "You are letting me go," she said softly. "I am choosing not to cage you," he replied. "There is a difference." The statement settled heavily inside her. For years, Daniel had equated love with provision, believing that building an empire was the ultimate proof of devotion. Now he understood that love required presence, humility, and sometimes the willingness to step aside entirely. He was no longer asking her to sacrifice her dream for his comfort. He was offering her autonomy without negotiation. Emily turned back toward the river, watching reflections fracture and reform with each ripple. 6 months earlier, she had walked away, feeling small, overlooked secondary. Now she stood rooted in her own power, an internationally recognized designer invited to study in Paris under a legend. She did not need Daniel to complete her. She had already become whole. That realization changed everything. Slowly, she faced him again. "I do not need you, Daniel," she said calmly. The words were not cruel, they were honest. A flicker of pain crossed his expression, but he nodded. "I know. But I want you," she continued, her voice steady as steel beneath silk. "I want the man who learned to listen, the man who stepped back from power to understand partnership, the man who supported my future, even when he thought it would not include him." Daniel inhaled sharply, as though bracing for impact he had not expected. Emily closed the distance between them by a single step. "I am going to Paris," she said. "I am building my career. I am choosing myself first." And then, without hesitation, she added, "I am choosing you too. Not because I am afraid to be alone, not because I need your name or your empire, but because life is richer when we stand beside each other as equals." The shift in his expression was immediate and profound. Relief mingled with awe. He reached for her hands carefully, as if aware that this reconciliation was not a return to the old marriage, but the beginning of something entirely new. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. Emily held his gaze without wavering. For the first time, certainty did not feel like control. It felt like clarity. Yes. Outside the city continued its restless pulse, unaware that within the quiet gallery 2 people had rewritten the terms of their love. Emily Parker was no longer the woman who waited beside cold candles. She was the woman who chose her future deliberately. And Daniel Brooks, once defined by dominance, now understood that the greatest power he could hold was the privilege of being chosen back. 6 months later, the balcony lights of a quiet Paris apartment glowed softly against the evening sky, and the Eiffel Tower shimmered in the distance like a constellation brought down to earth. Emily Parker rested her hands on the iron railing, breathing in the cool night air that carried the faint hum of the city below. Paris had welcomed her, not as a visitor, but as a creator. Under Isabelle Laurent's guidance, she spent long days inside the atelier, sketching, shaping, learning the delicate tension between precision and emotion. Her newest designs had already begun circulating through European fashion circles, whispers of a rising designer whose work carried both elegance and quiet defiance. Inside the apartment, Daniel Brooks closed his laptop and stepped onto the balcony beside her. His life had changed as profoundly as hers. The empire he once controlled with relentless intensity now ran through trusted executives, leaving him time to travel between Chicago and Paris without sacrificing the balance he had fought to build. The man who once believed success meant constant motion had discovered the discipline of presence. Standing beside Emily in the soft glow of the Paris night, he felt a calm that boardroom victories had never delivered. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked gently, his arm settling around her shoulders. "Giving me another chance?" Emily leaned into him, her gaze drifting across the golden tower rising beyond the rooftops. Every relationship reaches a moment when pain can either fracture it completely or reshape it into something stronger. "We chose to grow instead of breaking," she said quietly. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and opened a small velvet box. Inside rested the phoenix ring she had once designed, now refined with delicate olive branches woven through the flames, a symbol not only of rebirth, but of peace earned after struggle. Emily smiled as he slid it onto her finger, realizing that the design born from heartbreak had become the emblem of their renewal. They stood together in the Paris night, no longer bound by obligation or illusion, but united by a choice they would continue making every day. Their past had nearly ended them, yet it had also taught them the rarest lesson love could offer. The strongest relationships are not built on perfection, but on 2 people brave enough to transform and then choose each other again. Stories like Emily and Daniel's are not really about romance. From a relationship expert's perspective, they are about transformation. Most relationships do not fail because love disappears. They fail because people stop growing, stop listening, and start assuming the other person will always remain. What saved this marriage was not passion money or grand gestures. It was accountability, self-reflection, and the courage to rebuild 2 independent lives before choosing to share one again. Real love is not possession. It is a daily decision between 2 whole people who continue to evolve. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that growth and second chances are possible when we are brave enough to face the truth. And before you go, leave a comment with just 2 simple words that capture the heart of this story: choose love.